So we are obviously very much focused on gene expression in this class, as I've said over and over. We won't see it again for a little while, except as we're talking about the way that certain hormones function, both the water-soluble and the lipid-soluble, because they impact both synthesis and secretion of other hormones. So whenever we think of synthesis, we have to think of the gene level. As well, in targeting the specific cells that they're going to affect, some of the responses are related to increased protein synthesis, decreased protein synthesis. Whenever we hear of that, we must think of gene expression regulation, up and down, increase or decrease. Well, now let's return to the basics. And I know this is review for most everyone, but I think it's a worthy opportunity to cover the material and just kind of review it. There are many different hormones, many different glands, and it's always good practice to take a look at them here and there. In addition, we want to, just get my pointer going here. We want to remind ourselves that we're not thinking just of hormones as they affect different endocrine organ systems and then their target tissues for the function. We're thinking of the entire organism. So can anyone tell me the two primary functions of every living organism? After we're born, what's the first thing we must do? Survive, right? So survival is first, and then second is reproduce. And obviously the neuroendocrine system, the way that we're going to study it, is completely related to survival and to reproduction. So the entire organism, brain and behavior, must be involved, and we must be able to coordinate hormones with behavior. And of course, the nervous system, in particular the brain, are very much responsible for that. A prime example, of course, is if we don't eat when we're hungry. If we can't coordinate hunger and ingestive behavior, we're not going to live very long. Not going to survive, probably not going to reproduce. If receptive behavior is not coordinated with appropriate hormonal and physiological, biological preparation for copulation and conception, there won't be a successful reproduction. So I don't think we have to stretch things too far to find other examples that are quite obvious. And they'll come out through the semester as we proceed. What we do have to remember is that somehow humans have found ways to mess all of this up, and things don't quite work right all the time. We throw exogenous hormones into our bodies that have significant effects. We somehow put ourselves into stressful situations that can mess up just about everything. There's mental disorders that are numerous, involving disruptions of the endocrine systems, the neuroendocrine systems as well, in particular the thyroid. And I've even forgotten where I've found this illustration, but it just seems to be so calm and relaxing that I like to use it whenever I have the chance. So the brain is very large, as we know, with the brain stem coming down to the spinal cord, and the hypothalamus with the pituitary is just this small part here, and has tremendous effects on behavior, the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic and parasympathetic, and the endocrinology. So we present this in a format to help understand how all of this is coordinated. How are the neural circuits coordinated such that we get the coordination? It is possible to stimulate parts of the hypothalamus, and animals will display a complete behavioral display, offensive display, defensive display with the piloerection the distribution of blood, increased blood pressure and heart rate, all the things that we think of if we're in a a frightening situation with the fight or flight response being triggered. So all of that, including heightened attentiveness to the environment and the appropriate pupil reaction, and so on and so forth, just from stimulating a small portion of the hypothalamus. Injecting certain compounds triggers seeking of fluid and tremendous, sometimes robust fluid intake behaviors. Same thing with ingestive behaviors. It's possible to lesion parts of the hypothalamus, like the ventromedial hypothalamic nucleus, kind of a classic one in the old psychology courses, and the animals become hyperphagic, out of control, and just eat and eat and eat and become very obese. So for such a teeny tiny spot in the central nervous system, it has tremendous power. So we don't want to lose sight of that in this advanced course, really where I see it as an organismal neuroendocrinology course. Definitely a molecular neuroendocrinology course, but let's always try to go back to the organism level whenever we can to put it all into perspective and keep that true function in mind. So the research includes cell biology, genetics, anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, medicine, and psychology. So some of each of these is going to be a component of nearly all of the lectures that we cover. As I said, every so often I'll review a research article. It'll either be embedded within a lecture or I'll have dedicated slides to a research article. We are thinking of this, as I said, as an integrated functional neuroendocrine system. So there's physiological and behavioral responses that emerge from activations, differential activations of different parts of the collective nervous system. So the ones that we're going to give a bit of attention to are the limbic hypothalamic pituitary axis and the limbic hypothalamic brainstem axis. So this first axis obviously takes us to a neuroendocrine response, and the second axis takes us to the brainstem where we have impact on behavior and the autonomics, the autonomic nervous system, and so on and so forth. So this flowchart concept map takes us through some of this and helps us to put it into the broad perspective. So there's either an internal or external change. So we've talked about the cell membrane separating the intracellular compartment from the extracellular compartment, and then everywhere in our body where there's a junction between the internal environment, the inside of our body, and the external environment, the outside of our body, there's a layer of cells. So the membrane of those membranes, collective membranes of those cells, are also forming the barrier between the internal environment and the external environment. So there's information that comes from inside our body and from outside our body constantly. Pressure, I always go to the UBF, little pocket of air in our intestine that's the unborn fart, the UBF. So we all know about that. If you have one of those, whenever you have one of those and you're not in an area where you can relax and politely relieve yourself, there's a lot of attention that goes into keeping that contained, self-contained behavior under control, and it's a primary example of a change in the internal environment that does reach the level of conscious awareness, as it would come from the stretch receptors of the gut tube. Full urinary bladder is another big example. That afferent signal coming into the nervous system, integrating center, and this is all inclusive. Spinal cord, brainstem, higher brain centers where you're sitting consciously trying to pay attention, but all you can think about is keeping your bladder from going or controlling that UBF. As well, there is a direct impact on the endocrine integrating centers. I'll make that plural because I think we can come up with examples of peripheral endocrine integrating centers. Some peripheral organs do a lot of integration just on their own, but we're thinking more of the nervous system and the hypothalamus. But that's fine to keep our mind open to other organ systems that are not directly involved with the hypothalamus and the pituitary. And the pancreas is a prime example, as I said, the endocrine pancreas. So the endocrine integrating center will have efferent signals. So the afferent is bringing the affect of the internal or external environment to the nervous system. The efferent system brings the effect, the response, through the organism, and typically it becomes either some internal change, chemical change in the internal milieu, or microenvironment, or it's an overt behavioral change visible to the external environment. Regardless, these efferent signals have to go to different effectors, and there's a large number of them, and ultimately then to bring about an appropriate response. And this is the main reason I've selected this slide, because the appropriate response is what is most important. If we use the example of someone letting their urinary bladder go or releasing their UBF in an inappropriate fashion, that's a prime example. But more so in mental illness, appropriate responses are not always generated. So one prime example is, of course, anxiety disorders or panic disorders, where there is no true alarming stimulus coming from either internal or external environment. It's generated somewhere within the nervous system, but the response, therefore, to a neutral environment for some individuals is a full-blown anxiety or panic attack. Social anxiety is a prime example. There's no reason that a social setting should cause such an exaggerated emotional, somatic motor and visceral motor and endocrine response in an individual. So there's an inappropriate response. Something throughout this circuitry to integrate all of this is not functioning properly. And without doubt, we can focus attention on the limbic system, especially the subcortical limbic system. First, here in the upper left, we see a mid-sagittal section of the human brain, zooming in on the upper portion of the brain stem that includes the thalamus and hypothalamus. So here's that little hypothalamus with the pituitary gland. We're most familiar with that. So this is a slide telling about the limbic hypothalamic pituitary axis. So over here on the right-hand side, we see the cerebral cortex in the reddish-brown coloration, and subcortical limbic structures in the pinkish-red coloration, and the thalamus is put in there for orientation, although the thalamus is very much involved in emotional and cognitive function, not just relaying sensory information from the spinal cord to the cortex. So damage to the thalamus can bring about inappropriately coordinated responses to internal or external environmental perturbations. Maybe not as coordinated as you would get or as profound as you would get by focusing on the hypothalamus for stimulation or lesioning, but still it has significant involvement. Because we need to associate our incoming environmental information, external or internal, with our limbic responses. So the higher centers are typically this cortex, and then the subcortical limbic structures. Here we see this is called the cingulum. This is called the hippocampus. The amygdala is here. We see these fiber tracts, the fornix, the stria terminalis, the hypothalamus. If not a primary target of all these outputs, definitely is a secondary output of many of these outputs of these limbic areas that we talked about. Olfaction having a direct input into the limbic system. Hippocampus, most of you have probably heard about, very much involved in learning and memory. If it's damaged, there are memory problems, as we'll discuss. But also, it's responsible for negative feedback, at least for the function of the adrenal gland, and that's where it's involved in the modulation. If there's damage to the hippocampus, then the adrenal responses to stress become there. So remember, the modulation is the hypothalamus being regulation for the adrenal cortex, on or off, or increase or decrease, I guess I should say. And the hippocampus is involved in the modulation. When exactly do we begin to increase? How rapidly do we increase? How high do we go? How long do we sustain? And when do we begin to turn it off? How rapidly do we turn it off? And do we bring it back to baseline or below baseline after the response? So individuals with hippocampal lesions tend to have exaggerated responses to stressful situations. And that becomes a vicious cycle, as we'll see in just a while. So this system can coordinate neuroendocrine and behavioral responses. So the output of many of these areas is directly into the hypothalamus, either directly onto neuroendocrine cells or indirectly onto other cells that innervate the neuroendocrine cells of the hypothalamus. Next, then, the limbic hypothalamic brainstem axis is going to contribute the other part, the coordinated behavioral and autonomic responses. However, we know that within the autonomic nervous system is the sympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system innervates the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla releases adrenaline or epinephrine, which is a hormone. So that is a part of the connection between this response system and another endocrine system, not just the neuroendocrine system that would be involved, as we mentioned in the previous slide. So there's linkages of both the somatic and the visceral motor and the neuroendocrine response. And that, of course, is by the hypothalamus playing an integral role in ascending and descending neurocircuitry that's more horizontal for association and looping circuits that talk to each other and say, should I turn you on? Yes, I should. How much? And that can communicate on all various levels. This is just showing up and down levels of hierarchy in this panel on the right, but we know that in the cerebral cortex you can have right-left hemisphere communication. One portion of the cerebral cortex to another portion. The frontal lobe is what they're focusing on here, having significant connection with the limbic lobe and emotional input, and these communications exist also from the limbic lobe to the hypothalamus, which is what we saw on the previous slide. And between the limbic lobe and the cortex and the hypothalamus, or the limbic lobe and the hypothalamus, these communications act at the subconscious level. So we're not really aware of when we activate our adrenal medulla or our adrenal cortex. We're, of course, aware of increased heart rate and the blood flow and all the other activational systems involved, but we can't say, oh, my adrenal gland just turned on at a conscious level. Adrenal cortex, I'm talking about. So obviously in a stress response we get adrenaline and adrenocortical steroid release. The adrenocortical steroid release is through neuroendocrine regulation. Sorry not to have pointed that out as we were going along here. So the hypothalamus is an overall integration center of the autonomic nervous system, called the boss in this introductory slide, that has descending connections other than controlling the pituitary. We're now looking at it down to the brainstem. So the reticular formation of the brainstem, it's reticular because there's neurons scattered throughout a lot of heavily myelinated pathways coming up and down, and doing what are horizontal level or same level communications and a variety of things like that. So the neurons just get scattered around throughout. It's not a smooth layer of gray matter like the cortex, where almost all of these are neurons. In the brainstem, they're just kind of patchy, although it is still functionally discrete and localized. But therefore, it was called reticular formation by the early anatomists. So this is where we find hot spots, electrical stimulation, excitation with glutamate and excitatory transmitter, or using lidocaine, a form of novocaine, to knock it out temporarily to block the sodium channels, kind of like we block the nerves so we don't feel the pain. They inject it into these areas of the brain and see what function is lost or activated. So there's regulation of pupil size, respiration, heart rate, blood pressure, swallowing, and on. So all the things that we would expect to be regulated in an appropriate response. So I always use the example, if you're going to be running away from a dinosaur, you don't want to be leaving a trail of pee, urine, or feces. You need to activate the blood flow appropriately, and all of those types of things. So it's no time to sit and relax when the dinosaur is going to chase you. You don't need to be swallowing. Your respiration needs to be increased, and so on and so forth. The spinal cord, of course, is where we're going to see the levels of urination, defecation, erection, and ejaculation reflexes regulated from these higher centers. So the hypothalamus is strategically located to contribute coordinating efforts all the way up and down the board here. So let's try to look at this in a slightly more sophisticated type of a concept map or flow chart, where, again, there's a sensory stimulus. If there is no novel stimulus to the environment, then we're at homeostatic level, and there's no reason to be adapting things up and down. So there's always some type of an input, external environment or internal environment, that shifts things from where they were. If it's a resting state, then we're shifted away from a safe zone in our homeostatic levels on things. This will reach the level of the cerebral cortex by whatever means, and we'll look at some of that circuitry in a moment. The integration occurs within the association areas of this part of the brain. Integrated information is passed on to the limbic system, creates emotion. That feedback from that emotive limbic system to the cortex creates an awareness of the emotion. So there's a heightened awareness in cases of external environmental excitement of an individual. You see the dinosaur. Your limbic system tells the cortex, yeah, that's a dinosaur, and you damn well better pay attention to it. You better be alert, and you better get things figured out, and try to remember some past survival strategy of how we escaped the dinosaur before, which will be important for one of the next slides that we'll look at. Then the hypothalamus and the brainstem can initiate the somatic motor responses, both the voluntary and the involuntary or unconscious types of responses. Autonomic response, endocrine response, and immune response. And autonomic can contribute to endocrine, and endocrine can contribute to immune, and autonomic can contribute to immune as well. So we don't want to forget our immune system is very important for survival, so it should be integrated into this overall survival strategy-based system of neuroendocrinology. So this is a figure from our text showing, again, the environmental stimulus, a collection of sensory nerves to bring information, ultimately, multiple synapses, most likely, of course, to the higher brain centers. These nerve impulses are transduced into neurotransmitters that can have effects on behavioral responses themselves, can affect the hypothalamus, for example, with corticotropin-releasing hormone, part of this activation of the adrenal cortex that I've been using as an example along, is going to affect the anterior pituitary, get the ACTH, the adrenocorticotropic hormone, to go to the adrenal cortex, one of the endocrine glands, so that the glucocorticoid hormones are released, and they're going to contribute to physiological responses. So what I want to do now is think of the behavioral responses and then some of these physiological responses, and think about how important it is to have them coordinated. I know all this is obvious, but I do like to state and restate the obvious in many of the presentations that I give, as I don't think there's any real harm there. So the behavioral responses, that increased arousal, attentiveness to the environment, so scanning our environment, fine-tuning our auditory system, and all those types of responses that you might think about. Flight or fight, so think of the motor system being charged. You're starting to build up the tone in the muscles and get ready to make that decision. And learning and memory. Right? So you've got to assess the environment. So is that a T-Rex or is it a velociraptor? I encountered a velociraptor a month ago, and it was terrain similar to this, and I ran this way and that way, and I survived, so I'm going to try to do that again. Let me, recall that and put forth that pattern to see if I can survive. So then you survive again, so you learn that new one, survival strategy, and you store it away in your memory. So if we think of it that way, on the most primal levels, I guess, it helps to make sense of it all. So physiological responses, these steroid hormones, the glucocorticoid hormones, will stimulate neurochemical release in the brain, as an example. And skeletal muscle decreases protein synthesis, gene expression, increases protein degradation, some type of enzyme, degradative enzyme activation, decreases glucose uptake in the skeletal muscle, and the adipose tissue decreases glucose uptake and increases lipid mobilization. And then in the liver, increases glycogen synthesis. I think that should be decreases glycogen synthesis, because the whole focus of the glucocorticoid hormone is to begin looking for sources of reserved material that can ultimately be freed up as glucose or used to make new glucose. So I think this would either be increased glycogen degradation or decrease glycogen synthesis. Anyway, little error here, little error there, we can live with it all. So we see how that is all coordinated. So very early on, maybe you've got the adrenaline going, you're burning up whatever glucose is in the blood, you're making your decisions, pulling out the old strategy, comparing it to new stuff, fit the pattern the best you can and get the heck out of there and survive. As you're running away, you're going to start to need glucose being contributed to the blood to replace what you've used, and so on and so forth. So that's why the glucocorticoid response brings the delayed contribution to the blood glucose to carry you over a longer period of time. So why have linkages between the memory systems and behavior, autonomic and endocrine systems, responses to environmental challenges? So we can use this slide to build on this question, the answer to this question. Again, the stimuli, visual, somatosensory, pain in this case here, gustatory, taste, olfaction, they all feed in the afferent inputs into a temporary storage buffer in the cerebral cortex. And then this data is selected for transfer to the short-term memory, and that data will be transferred ultimately to long-term memory, typically consolidated in sleep. That data transfer can be influenced by excitation, rehearsal, association of old and new data. So pull out your old survival strategy, implement it in your new attempted survival strategy. If you survive, you've got a whole new survival strategy to push into long-term memory. Sometimes too much excitement can interfere with forming long-term memory. Certainly rehearsal is good, and I recommend that in every course, right? It is possible to have the data from long-term memory retrieved or become unretrievable, and possibly anywhere along the line forget, or the data permanently lost. And of course, there's a tremendous amount of interest in exactly how neurons do all this stuff, but for our part, we know that somewhere within here, the cerebral cortex going to short-term memory, the short-term memory is the hippocampus. But there's other limbic structures that are receiving the input, that are sending this information to the hypothalamus to coordinate the behavioral response, as well as the neuroendocrine response and the autonomic nervous system response to this stimulus. So the last thing that I'll comment on today is the impact of these glucocorticoids that we mentioned from the adrenal gland on hippocampal neurons. So here we see a healthy hippocampal pyramidal neuron, bunch of dendrites up top, big cell body and nucleus, basal dendrites here. Through the aging process, this becomes a little less ornate and kind of shriveled and not looking so good. And part of that aging process might be due to the lifelong effects of the glucocorticoids. Definitely, with age and with extensively, dramatically sustained, highly elevated levels of glucocorticoids, combined especially with any other extrinsic injuries or diseases, a slight hypoxia, little shift in blood flow, a couple of concussions, whatever it might be. There can even be neuronal death brought about by the adrenal glucocorticoids. So the stress contributing to this has a great potential through the ACTH and the adrenal gland in the hippocampus. So this is what I was saying, is that as we age, our stress response, so these neurons that they're collectively reflecting on here in the hippocampus are also involved in that modulation of the negative feedback system to bring the stress response at the level of the hypothalamus and the pituitary and the adrenal gland back to baseline levels. So as we age, we're a little less effective, over the years in bringing that stress response under control and back to baseline levels within a reasonable time frame that might be appropriate for the stimulus. And I recognized this in my dad, and I always knew that he had, this trigger or that trigger. And you just have to touch on it, that he'd get started and be going, and you could have him going the whole day and stuff. So maybe this was in part what was contributed, how that was contributed from his lifelong experiences. Who knows? Or maybe me. Maybe this stress was me. But if there is other damage to the hippocampus, then that system is thrown off as well. So I'll stop there, and we'll pick up with this slide on the Wednesday lecture, the next lecture, completing lecture 1 and then chapter 1, and then we'll go on to chapter 2.